Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Good evening. It gives me great pleasure to moderate this particular session on US-India digital cooperation. When we were setting out the Global Technology Summit, some people turned around and said in the feedback that we got is, why focus just on US-India? Why put it up there on day one? But as the Honorable External Affairs Minister said in his opening remarks for the GTS, this is a unique relationship. In many ways, one could say that it is this relationship that could potentially shape the future of the digital bridge across the world. What that exactly means, what that possibility, how that possibility reveals itself is exactly why we're here in this particular session to discuss. And I think it's a crucial time for India as well. Over the next 12 months, there's a very good chance that India will have its own legal architecture for data and for regulating data, which will impact and shape the way it thinks about AI, other emerging technologies. And it'll have to think much more carefully, perhaps, about international cooperation on tech and the crucial relationship with the United States. So I'm going to dive straight into it. I'm not going to provide introductions again. That's already been done for the spectacular cast of actors on this panel. But let me start a question for Ambassador Renupal. Ma'am, you lead a new innovative division within the Ministry of External Affairs that was only created earlier this year, the NEST, or the New Emerging Science and Tech Division. Before we dive into the weeds on US-India, could you just give us a sense of why was this division set up? What is it that it's supposed to do? And what's the kind of vision going forward?
Rudy, she may have dropped off.
Okay, right. Well, clearly, these are the kind of the trials in the virtual environment. People log off, they log on. Internet goes off. So while we wait for Ambassador Pal to come back, let me just switch to Jake Gullish. Jake, you've spent time in Delhi. You were at the US Embassy here. You've spent the better part of a couple of decades on trying to understand and design the mechanics between the US and India when it comes to keep this conversation sort of going. If I could just perhaps start with an opening kind of question is, how do you see that relationship at present? What are the defining contours of that digital relationship? And what do you think can happen in the near future with the Biden administration?
Great. Well, first, I want to thank Carnegie for inviting me to this esteemed panel. And I want to thank the audience for listening and their interest overall. We're really in a critical time right here. We're moving into an entirely new generation of digital economic development. It's privacy-based. We could talk a lot about how we got here. And the US-India relationship was critical to getting us, not only the United States and India, but the entire world here. Indulge me a little bit going backwards. It all started with the Y2K problem. Not all of us are old enough to remember that. But India really showed its wherewithal from a technology point of view by bringing technology scale to a global environment for the first time. And that cannot be underestimated in its importance. Because after the Y2K, very quickly, we switched to an outsourcing model where India provided a powerhouse of technology capability for not only American companies, but American companies were very well positioned to utilize it, but actually developed the next series of generation globally out of India, even though that India itself was not a heavy user. Now, what you have now through a series of major trend line changes is we're now moving into a privacy-based point of view. The United States and India, we are integrated in a digital level like no two other countries at all. Start with people, Indian American community, start in our education, the United States education environment. You could talk about the many, many tens of millions of Indians providing digital products and services and developing those. You add the capital from the United States, you add the corporate environment, you add the overall social environment on top of that, moving into media and entertainment. The two countries are integrated synergistically in a way that no two other large digital countries are. And now that India's moved into being a major market, not just a provider on the back end, we're really focusing on a very interesting time. We're going to be transitioning to, as I said, a sort of a privacy-based sort of regime. There's a lot of questions to be answered. Both countries are asking those. Both countries have privacy bills facing each other right now. We have a federal bill trying to pass. India's got a center bill. We have to answer some really critical questions about the data economy. There's digital services taxes, there's cross-border data flows, there's privacy, there's content issues. And so the challenge is before us for the United States and India, we need to create some sort of digital partnership, whether it's a digital and strategic alliance or a U.S.-India strategic digital partnership. The key word is strategic. It's so important from not only the security side of point of view, but from the economics, job creation, and innovation and investment. We need to figure out a model that we can work together at the high level to benefit from these technologies together, but also we need to manage a number of needling commercial, tax, and other sorts of operational issues. And we can only do that if we have sort of a strategic umbrella. So I'm very encouraged about the administration, the U.S. administration, and where we're going. I think it's clear there'll be a look at increasing utilization of multilateral environments. And the challenges before the new administration and India to find that accommodation where we can find that, maximize that synergy, and provide opportunities for global leadership going forward at this critical time in the sector.
So, Jay, I take the point before I move on to Nandini and Modan is there's a lot going on. It's a wide canvas as far as India is concerned, the US is concerned. There are questions about harmonizing privacy bills. There's questions about a common but not the same approach to data, etc. From your experience in government and now in an industry body, what's the right mechanism you talked about taking a step back and taking a strategic view of the tech to tech kind of dialogue. But how does that happen? And do you think that under the Biden administration, there will be a greater push for exactly this kind of a bridge? So, India and the US have a 2+2 dialogue where you've got defense and state, the MEA and the MOD in India, they get together. It's a successful arrangement that has borne fruit. Are you recommending something along those lines down the line?
Well, clearly we need to elevate the level of interaction around the digital arena, right? We got to be able to talk about advanced technology like quantum, AI, or more close to home 5G, so that we can position both countries to be leaders in those new technologies. And in the current environment, we have not been able to elevate it so that we can handle a lot of the, I say, needling commercial issues. There's a lot of issues on the ground that need to be reconciled, but that's going to build the wherewithal, the trust, the pathways for additional higher level arenas. I think in the security arena, technology is going to be critical. We don't need to go into the details there, but there are certainly a series of exquisite and advanced technologies that we both could benefit from the security space, but also commercially, we're moving very fast into a 5G application space. India is great with applications. There's underlying infrastructure that needs to be done there. And then we need common rules of the road. While I believe the United States and India need to develop those rules of the road, they need to be common rules of the road to pull in the larger partnership of democratic nations that really need to figure out, some key issues here. At the end of the day, it's a trust factor, right? Where it's trust not only between citizens or users with their government, it's citizens and users with companies It's also companies and government, because there's a critical law enforcement element of this. And there's got to be trust in the system. And so it's about having trust in information online, and moving forward off of that. And that's that real critical space that no country has solved right now. Each country is going to find its own context. But I think the strategic context to do this together for the United States and India is quite compelling. However, that has to be done at a fairly high level, getting buy-in, and then you get, the communities and ecosystems below that to follow suit.
Thanks, Jay. I'm going to come back to some of the divergences and this question of trust in a bit. But if I could just move to Nandini Kannan. Nandini, you're the executive director of the Indo-US Science and Tech Forum, which, as I understand it, is supported by the two governments. If we drill down from the 100,000-foot view, so the strategic dialogue, the need for common understanding, to the kind of 1,000-foot view, so kind of where the rubber hits the road when it comes to cooperation on research and development, science and tech, approaches to AI, for instance. These are areas that your organization has focused on. I was just wondering, can you just kind of take us through where are we at that level of cooperation?
So again, let me start by thanking the Carnegie and Rudra for the invitation. I'm absolutely delighted and honored to be part of this panel. As you said, the Indo-US Science and Technology Forum was set up in 2000, so we're 20 years old. And the goal was to try to bring together scientists and institutions, organizations from both sides. So part of our mission was to catalyze partnerships and then build that ecosystem where we have individual level collaborations, institutional collaborations, and then also collaborations between federal agencies and industry on both sides. So over 20 years, we've had a number of activities that have seeded. We've done workshops, convening activities that have brought together scientists from academia, national labs, industry from both sides. Some of these have led to joint funding calls between the two governments. So our organization focuses on the research and development, not so much on the industry and sort of the policy side. But as Jay talked about, he's looking at things from the government to government and the policy. We're looking at it as how do we bring the community of scientists together around emerging areas. So part of our mission is to look at those bleeding edge areas where synergies are to be had by bringing the two communities together. I'll give you a simple example before I dive into AI. So when the pandemic hit in March, we quickly got together and put out two calls around COVID-19. One was to bring US and Indian researchers already working on COVID through funding from their respective governments to add a partner on the other side. So that's the value of what this organization does. It helps to build those networks. And then we also did something around startups. So trying to bring US and Indian startup communities to look at how they can leverage technology or repurpose technologies for things like ventilators and masks and even sort of vaccine development. So that's a sweet spot for us, trying to find areas where there are synergies to be had and quickly bringing the two communities together. And one of the things I would say, I was overwhelmed with the response. We had over 600 applications within a month for proposals in COVID-19. So clearly there are communities on both sides really eager to work together. So one of the things our USSTF is doing, and we've got board approval, is a US-Indian partnership on AI, focusing on R&D. We're talking about bringing all the stakeholders, industry, academia, national labs, agencies on both sides to look at AI in sort of two broad thematics. One around AI for social good, things around explainability, bias, addressing issues that you've talked about like privacy, but looking at it from a research perspective. And on the other side, the flip side is access, data infrastructure. So issues like data quality, provenance, benchmarking. These are not always things that get talked about, but they're critical to using things like machine learning and deep learning. I was listening to some of the earlier sessions where people talk about, data being the fuel, the oil, the water. It's true, AI runs on data. And in order to have any coherent research collaboration between India and the US, we do need to talk about how we can share data. And there are models already in place in the past around things like bioinformatics. So I think RUSSTF has the opportunity to look at the 1,000-foot level, bring the communities together to talk about how some of these issues around privacy and access actually impact the research community, or what research questions do those open up, which may provide solutions or may provide some middle ground for governments as they deal with sort of these very difficult and thorny issues. I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take up sort of follow up at some point.
So, Nandini, I see that Ambassador Pal is back, but before I turn to her, just one short question is, in your efforts to kind of build these bridges and to build bridges of understanding between the two sides in R&D, in science and tech, etc., how involved is industry? How involved are universities in India? Are many IITs, the MITs in the US, etc.? Is there some kind of a centralizing, organized space where these different elements come together? Is that something that is needed?
It's definitely needed, and it's something we've thought of as we've developed this AI initiative. Part of what we're proposing is to have a lot of convening, scoping activities, bringing institutions and industry partners on board early, trying to set the landscape, identify areas that are sort of the low-hanging fruit, ripe for collaboration, and then trying to see if we can do some quick funding to keep these projects. We've been very successful in India. Most of the IITs and the Indian Institute of Science and Engineering, ISERs, have been funded through us. We funded a number of workshops and joint centers with top institutions on both sides. But I think with the AI, we're looking at it strategically, not just a one-off workshop, but looking at this as a 1 to 2 year activity for RUSSTF, where we put out position papers, where we put out reports, where we look at what are the emerging areas for research, where bringing US and Indian scientists, engineers, technology and companies together to look at sort of the big questions around algorithmic bias or explainable AI or some of these really emerging areas. And that will bring up issues around policy as well. So I think part of the discussion will lead to questions around policy. And that's why some of this conversation is fascinating, because you need research needs to happen, the policies need to be made. Sometimes policy dictates how research is done. And sometimes researchers can get together and sort of say, this is the sort of policy that helps or enables.
Well, I mean, that's exactly why you have think tanks and you have the academy, and hopefully that transmission works. But let me just go back to Ambassador Pal. Ambassador Pal is back with us. Ma'am, if I could ask you the question I did in the beginning is, and it leads from the point that Nandini was making about the importance of policy, is could you just take us through the rationale for setting up the new and emerging strategic technologies division within the MEA, which was created only earlier this year? What's the vision? What's the purpose of the division?
Yes, as you said, Rudra, I'm in the process of setting up this new division on new emerging and strategic technologies in the Ministry of External Affairs. The writ for this division is really to look at technologies which have strategic implications, assess foreign policy implications of ETs. Next division will eventually function as the nodal point to coordinate the Indian positions on the governance norms, standards, and rules which many expect to see come up for ETs in a plurilateral or multilateral context, including at the UN and relevant international organizations. And NEST will also help to build policy interfaces with key partner countries and international organizations in this context. We are also assisting internal stakeholders in India in their demand-driven technology pathways. We are integral to the Science Technology Innovation Policy 2020 deliberations, which are being led by the Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India, and we expect a new policy to be announced soon. NEST has also assisted in the outreach, which was recently done under the WebHub Summit to the Indian diaspora scientific community across 74 countries for almost a month-long brainstorming. And we are now working with the science ministries in India to come up with a program plan for taking these WebHub deliberations forward. We are also part of the working group which has been set up a national portal called Prabhas for effectively engaging with the Indian global science and technology community. So if I have to look at the raison d'etre for NEST, I have to say that India is not alone in getting a foreign office orientation on ET to connect in globally. ETs are going to acquire geopolitical connotations. And today, with the tremendous dynamism and progression that we are seeing in this sector, the governments need to channelize their impact in transforming their knowledge economy, in bringing depth to their socio-political systems, and in fact, in expanding the everyday interfaces available to their citizens. For this to be a robust system, they need synergy in the flow from the sciences to the policy formulation to application and implementation on the ground. And the utility of the ETs to sustainable development will be in direct proportion to which these are made visibly human-centric and of value to the long-term development and empowerment of citizens across countries. I've heard some of this echoed in a previous session, and I can't underscore it enough. I would say it is, of course, about science. It is definitely about the commercial value of these emerging technologies, but it has to be more fundamentally about people and how to better the quality of life, if you will, in a sustainable and eco-friendly manner. And for this, there is need to avoid barriers or disconnect between the knowledge generators, the knowledge implementers, and the knowledge users. And that's where the NEST focus is. As a country, I would say India has been a long votary of democratic and equitable access. And so we would be part of efforts to promote and build partnerships in the emerging technologies in a manner that universalizes a more positive narrative to the ETs. Solutions which we see through ETs will need collective thought. They will need collective refinement. They won't need work done in silos. They definitely have cross-border relevance and utility, and they're going to be part of the future of geopolitics, as I said. So NEST is essentially building capacities in the Ministry of External Affairs to connect into conversations on ETs. And we are relying not just on the Indian Foreign Service officers, but we have, through a rather laborious process since May, just last month, contracted some domain specialists as NEST fellows to be part of my team. So this is essentially the raison d'etre for the creation of NEST in MEA.
Thanks, Ambassador Pal. I'm going to come back to you, Ambassador Pal, on some of the questions on barriers, on the democratic dividend, and how that works out in the near future. But let me just turn to Modan for a couple of minutes. Modan, Ambassador Pal talked about the need for convergence, the need for, clearly there's a need in governments. India is one of them, where there's a very clear international focus on how India deals with other countries on technology, etc. From your vantage point, and someone who's tracked this space in the private sector, what more needs to be done to harmonize the digital ecosystems between the United States and India?
Yeah, first of all, thanks a lot for inviting me, and to the Carnegie Mellon and to you, Rudra. Before I answer that, I just want to give a brief context in terms of, especially for the audience, of how at least I look at the whole issue of data and digital. Okay, and what are we trying to harmonize? Okay, it's very important to understand. All of us say, and I've heard from Jacob also, that we say that data is the core of the future of any country's economy, isn't it? But it is not about just economy. Data, interestingly, has multiple other dimensions. Okay, in terms of how does it impact national security? How does it impact citizens' quality of life, as Renu has said, or citizens' rights itself? data impacts citizens' rights, along with economic development. Okay, so there are multiple other dimensions that has to be kept in mind when you're looking at any policy formulation on data. Second point I would like to mention is that unlike other resources, be it oil or anything else, okay, data doesn't exist in silo. The value of data doesn't exist in silo. Okay, the value of data comes from generating insights, patterns, predictions, and most often than not, breakthrough insights come from interaction of different sets of data. And some of that data could be cross-border. Some of this data could be between private sector and public sector within the country. The key challenge out here is that how do we balance this whole innovation and need for, I would say, in quote unquote, free flow of data to generate maximum value with the inherent risks of this free flow. And where policy making comes into the picture, where the policy tries to do good for the society and balance the risks. And we can all talk about various mechanisms out there, but one thing that at least which I feel is that unlike other areas of policy, okay, typically policy means that there should be certainty or there should be something which is fixed there for the next 10 years. In this area, in this emerging area, it's very, very difficult, okay, to have a policy which will not change in the next 10 years. What is easy is the direction of the policy. What is it long-term trying to achieve? And as we implement stuff, as technology evolves, as we understand from our experiments and initial implementations, what is this technology doing, or what are these data flows or the trade flows, data flows across border or within the country doing to citizens' rights, doing to national security? We need to fine-tune the policy. So in this context, if you really look at what can be done to harmonize, okay, I would put a few things, okay. I mean, so I'm not getting into very specifics because that's something which the detailing requires a lot more deliberation. But I think, be it on a multilateral basis or on a I would say bilateral basis between India and US, one can work on specific projects, okay, around creation of public digital goods. And it is also like a startup type of environment, okay, where you get some early wins, build that trust between or enhance that trust through public-private partnership. For example, can we create open AI models, okay, to be used across areas, okay, be it healthcare, and solve real problems, okay? This whole pandemic is there. How do we use open AI models and public-private partnership to address healthcare, address education, and areas which are important for both the parties? Lastly, I would like to say is that one has to, for this whole area of harmonization to move forward, two areas are important for both the parties, or both the countries to understand. One is shared understanding of each other's strategic interests, very important. Okay, and alignment on that. Secondly is that we have to, and we are, both the countries are trying to build their own data governance model right now. We have to ensure that we have compatible models of governance of data. Without that, the whole harmonization of the digital economy, which relies on these two fundamental pillars. One is a shared or a common understanding of each other's national of strategic interests, and secondly, having a compatible model of data governance. These are two pillars which has to be built. Solid foundation has to be built based on which this harmonization can happen. For harmonization, just to repeat, we should start as we build some of these governance processes with small, I would say, but important experiments, important, I would say, pilots within between these two countries with public-private partnership, and solve real problems which can be showcased.
Mohan, thanks a lot. It's interesting is in the opening remarks across all the four speakers, the terms that seem to keep getting highlighted, and I've written them down, is shared understanding, compatibility, and at the heart of it, it's trust. I take the point about open digital architectures, its importance, and transparency. But if I can come back to Jake for a second. Jake, while we talk about trust and its importance, and clearly different countries are going to have to figure out how they mechanize that trust in its sense. So how do you actually design this? But we seem to be living in a world, at least in the technology field, that's more balkanized and fragmented than it's collective. I mean, a year ago this time, very few would have guessed that the wheels would completely come off the US-China relationship. You had a trade war of sorts, but that the diplomatic relationship would divide as it has would have been a surprise to many in November, December of 2019. So, taking Modan's point, how do you build trust in what seems to be an increasingly balkanized universe, at least an increasingly balkanized data universe? How does that balance work out?
Yeah, it's both a bottoms up and a top down approach, right? Countries and in larger global societies, they take clear cues from leaders. And so as our two leaders meet, we're going to see what cues they provide us. And that provides the underlying background of how at least the government organizations are going to move. But there's also a bottoms-up approach for trust, right? I think one of the best ways to build trust in this privacy arena or the national security environment is actually get the cops talking to each other. When they need to, they have a counterpart that they can interact with. And I don't want to go too deep into law enforcement interaction or even deeper into sort of the intelligence community interaction, but those sorts of interactions are really, really critical. And they're important at the direct level so that Indian police officers have a corresponding partner on the U.S. side in law enforcement issues, whether that's a domestic issue or a call center fraud issue or a national security issue. They have to have those relationships that they can build upon. In addition, there's some multilateral tools or techniques or organizations that help. I mean, the one that comes to mind is the Budapest Convention. It's not perfect, but it's good. It's talking about how to expand cyber in the enforcement against cybercrime online. It's evolving as an organization because when it was founded, we were in a very different technology space, right? It was founded in much more of a telecommunication, telephone arena, and now we're very much in an online point to multi-point sort of web, right? And so those tools and techniques and relationships need to be updated as well. And, I'd encourage India to take a look at that organization. It's something that the United States has invested a lot of effort in as a government, and is tied to some elements of bilateral interaction, such as Cloud Act. That it's a little bit of a notional tool that people look to. Are you a member? Are you an active member? And so on. But it all comes back down to that direct relationship and the cues that we get from our various organizations and leadership.
Okay, thanks, Jane. Just to say, and this is not a plug, but we've got a fantastic Carnegie India paper out by Smiti Parshir and Pratik Jain, exactly the Budapest Convention and questions around data access. But I don't want to get too much into the weeds of what kind of collaboration that will be, questions around localization or the need for data access. We've got lots of panels at the GTS to do exactly that. But Ambassador Pal, if I could just turn to you for a second. Clearly, applications are seen today as strategic commodities. Countries can turn them on, countries can turn them off. In a sense, it shapes the balkanization of the internet. It shapes the splinternet, if you like. How do you see the space emerging as India internationalizes its policies around digital cooperation?
You're on mute, ma'am.
No, I'd like to begin by saying that the trust factor is going to be a very big factor in how these partnerships come about. And definitely the digital infrastructure for tomorrow will need to be transparent, will need to be equitable, inclusive, accountable. And as we've all been saying, it has to be dynamic enough to meet human-centric values in a non-discriminatory manner. But coming to specifically India's role, I think India will definitely have to be reckoned with in the area of data infrastructure and in the context of data security, given the geopolitics. We have vast amounts of data that need to turn into knowledge specific to solutions which will have global relevance. Our problems or our data contexts are not peculiar only to India. And this is quite a strength, to put it mildly. And that is the reason why any government in India will have to focus on localization of data, of manufacturing of products and technology. Data is a resource which has to be used responsibly. Having said that, I think governments have an innate capacity, if you will, to look at how they can ensure an enabling environment and safeguard issues of national security or misuse of technologies, protect privacy and security, and discourage discrimination and bring in some sort of a partnership which is creating a common set of goods, so to say. At the same time, we have to be realistic and realize that governments, democratic or otherwise, will of course look to secure their national sovereignty goals, their geopolitical goals. They will have differences in terms of the modalities and the depth of the governance systems and standards that they will support. Industry will of course want to capitalize on the emerging value of data, track behavioral patterns, accumulate user bases, and there will be attempts to control information streams to manipulate opinion. Online influence factors will multiply, and you're going to have all the digital threats like deepfakes and identity thefts, etc. And this is going to impact the individual. But I think the US and India are natural partners as democracies to come together to work on these issues in a manner that can be constructive, which can meet their strategic goals. And it's not something that they would be attempting for the first time. I mean, the relationship already has been technology driven. It has had strategic elements for the last some decades. And as democracies, their internal mechanisms will also have relevance to their credentials to partner in the creation of this. So I'm not too worried about balkanization if we can keep some of these parameters as the operational framework and perhaps try and facilitate what some have called a healthy network of networks.
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador Pal. And I'm going to come back to Modan on your views on how we get these healthy networks going. But we've got quite a few questions from the audience, and I've got one from Nandini. This question is from Rohan Joshi, and I think it alludes to this entire issue of collaboration. You're working in a space, as you said yourself in the introduction, that's a big remove from the policy space. And perhaps that's the biggest advantage that your institution has, to work in the kind of research environment, to work with universities. And Rohan asked the question to say is, how do we, in a sense, get that AI kind of collaboration between the US and India actually going? So, you look at data provenance, you look at different ways in which countries treat data, the US and India. But is there a thread that ties that AI collaboration, which could actually almost work almost like on the background at the academic level, as Jay said, from the bottom up, pushing this collaboration forward as the policy architecture begins to take shape?
That's a great question. Absolutely. I think what's interesting about looking at the current landscape, as everybody on this panel has already alluded to, India and US have a long history of collaboration, even in science and technology. Jake talked about the Indian diaspora. Silicon Valley there's so many Indians who've gone there and set up industry. So there's a vibrant community, and there's a vibrant community in India that is already collaborating in many of these emerging areas. You have partnerships in AI, data science, machine learning. You see a lot of research collaborations that have just happened. So one thing we as an organization can do is to help identify some of these threats, including issues around privacy, data provenance, things that really will help push the research to another level, accelerate progress. And going back to what Ambassador Paul said, we're looking at applications in areas like healthcare and education and agriculture as a way to bring these partnerships, because those are the areas where we really need to adopt these new technologies. And in every one of these areas, the questions about data access, data provenance, how do you share data across different communities? We have some examples where there are standards set up by professional organizations. I mean, I'll point to astronomy as a field that's done a remarkable job setting global standards for how data are collected. So there are lessons to be learned from some of those communities for research data. But as you talk about questions around access versus privacy, it's something even the research community struggles with. I mean, how do you look at health data, and when you look at data across, the genetic data with imaging data, and you start to put everything together, issues around privacy, you may end up unmasking individuals just because of combining massive data sets. So there are tools, issues around differential privacy. These are research questions that the community has taken up to address some of these issues that have cropped up around ethics. They are now talking about how do you define algorithmic fairness? How do you decide whether an algorithm is fair? You need metrics for that. So a lot of the work around benchmarking, creating knowledge networks, somebody talked about having open AI. So these are tools where you can actually verify, you can test whether an algorithm is fair. So I think the research community has an opportunity here to look at the existing landscape and see what are the research questions that could help address some of the concerns around privacy versus access. We're talking about AI for social good. So how do you have explainable AI within the healthcare system? So how does someone take an image and then come up with a prediction, or even in precision medicine? How do you have algorithms that are explainable? What is the research behind that? So I think research in some of these areas, as applied to real social problems, gives us an opportunity to understand sort of some of the nuances of access versus privacy. And while that may not dictate policy, it can certainly inform policy. What happens when you set very tight controls? How does that affect? Or does the research have to, do we have to figure out in the research community to talk about synthetic data? So these are issues, I think, that will be important. And so as researchers get together, you get agencies, you get governments, you get industry, you address some of the fundamental questions around access versus privacy and provenance. And I think that can inform policy. And I think Modan made the point that policy in this area is going to have to be agile. We can't talk about a 10, 20-year policy for emerging technologies. We have to keep our pulse on how quickly these things are changing. So that's a challenge for governments. But I think the research community in some way can provide some unique insights.
So, Madan, if I can quickly switch to you. I've got two questions. So one, just following from Nandini's comments, is do you genuinely see a near future where countries like the US, India, perhaps Japan, other friendly countries can get together and actually have a meaningful dialogue on emerging tech standards? That's my first question. I've got another one, a slightly more prosaic one on movement of people and skills from the audience. But let me just, from your vantage point, how do you see this ET standard space working out? Madan? Okay, I think Madan's on.
Yeah. Can you
go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
The democracies like India, US, Japan, they're coming together, okay, to and sorting out their differences is relatively easy, I would say, relatively easy. Okay, and creating common standards, because fundamentally both of all these countries have some fundamental values around which the policies will get formulated. One of them, for example, is the respect for the individual, okay, individual rights, okay. And as we think about this network of networks, the bigger problem is how do we create a governance mechanism so that some of these tools and all are not available, okay, to countries or individuals who can actually vitiate the entire network? How do we create a network of networks where bad apple cannot come in? Unlike other areas, in a network of network, even if you have 100 networks, okay, one network is bad, it can kill everyone, literally, okay, because of the network effect. I think that is the biggest problem. The countries like India, US have come together and solve. I think that is a bigger problem.
Okay, I mean, if I just push you on that point, I mean, I take the point about values, individual interests, and the problem of network of networks. But from your vantage point, is there something more that needs to be done at the industry level or at the government level to move beyond the debates around localization and privacy to genuine emerging tech partnerships? Because many would argue that there's a congruence. On the one hand, we talk about AI partnerships. It's the big theme in almost any summit and conversation. As I say, at GTS, we don't have one on AI. We don't have a dedicated panel on AI, perhaps for this reason. Eric Schmidt, the other day, I was hearing him on one of the panels, and he was talking about the importance of innovation alliance on emerging technologies. And he said it's not possible without the US and India. So at the strategic level, that makes sense. But how do you actually get to that place, given the differing approaches to data, to technology in itself? From an industry perspective, do you think it's actually possible in the near future?
Yeah, I mean, the way I look at it, okay, is that, and I'm just taking a very industry perspective of solving problems, okay. In the industry, you will always have differences, okay. Even in a company where there are multiple people, multiple stakeholders, okay, there will be differences. As you try to solve those differences, okay, the best approach for me, okay, is to the two countries come together, identify areas where they can easily collaborate, where the difference is minimal. Solve those problems, okay, in a defined framework, prove it that it helps, which itself will give huge learnings for how to build the big picture. So one approach is to try to build the best of the big picture and can take years. Other approach is be agile. You identify the healthcare issue that can be solved using AI. Let the private-public partnership happen. Let there be a mechanism by which two countries come together in a defined data set using defined digital tools, solve a particular problem. Let's see whether they can solve it or not. What are the issues that come in? What are the privacy issues that come in? Can that be a basis for or input to a wider, I would say, alignment on the broader strategic interests around data and privacy? I would want to follow, you've asked me, a more agile approach rather than a big bang approach.
Well, it seems like we've got the perfect makeup on this panel for that agile approach to come together. You've got the MEA, USIBC, you've got someone from deep in research and industry, and maybe that's the conversation that just needs to bear fruit more. We're coming to the close of this session, but I'm going to end with this point, in this question around multilateralism and internationalization of data and technology, and where does India and the US fit in that? And there's a perfect question from Oliver at University College in London, who also happened to be an old colleague and someone who's written a lot on technology. Oliver asked a question, and perhaps I could take this to you, Jake, is we often talk a lot about multilateralism of technology. The G20 is stocked up as a mediating body by which we can think of common norms of trust around technology. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe have talked about the free flow of data. There's a call in Paris which talks about a collective approach. But from your opening remarks, I detect that you're a skeptic of multilateralism, and perhaps for good reason, in government. Are we talking up solutions through multilateral platforms that is actually in paradox to the universe that we live in, which is more nationalistic in itself, which is more focused on borders? Or is there a middle ground to be had? So if I could just give you the table on that.
Sure, absolutely. So I'm a realist. There are roles for multilateralism. There's roles for plurilateralism. There's roles for bilateral, and then there's roles for a larger stakeholder community to move. We're not going to answer some of the real big questions with consensus at a global nature. Firstly, you have a subset of democracies that think about things very differently. That's a natural grouping. We have a lot of natural commonalities, and we need to start with there. The way that citizens and democracies interact with their government is different than other countries, and that's true of the other stakeholders in terms of academia and the corporate world as well. And you need to bring all of those together. There's going to be some situations where multilateralism may work, whether it's the Budapest Accord, which we mentioned, or something around digital service taxes that people are talking about, or if it's a privacy regime that's sort of conceptualized by either OECD or the APEC region, the cross-border privacy rules. Not everyone's going to fit into that same package. But if you start to have groups of like-minded individuals, corporations, and governments, you start to create the baselines, the standards and norms that are going to guide the overall architecture or the overall sector. Then you need to have some flexibility. AI is very different in medical science than it is in another sector at a swimming pool or something around sports, or transportation issues have other safety concerns. Certainly national security has other concerns. So you're going to need that sort of flexibility, but you got to come to some common rules of the road. Not everyone's going to agree to them, but if you have a general grouping, you can move things in the right direction, right? And that's that critical piece. And where the United States and India, if we're in sync, if we're aligned and moving in a common direction, I think that provides tremendous leadership to optimize this for a certain community of nations. And we want to bring more countries in there and more corporations into some of these structures as well, but also individuals and academia. It really requires the whole the whole shebang, so to speak. And that's the real difficult part of what we're talking about. And that's the real challenge. But you can do the bottoms up work. But if you don't have that strategic guidance or leadership, it's really hard to find that optimized middle ground.
Jake, very quickly, in your reading of the Biden administration, are we going to see a lot more effort towards that strategic direction? Or do you think it's going to be a different kind of a format? Or, I mean, the US-India relationship is already at a super high point. I mean, whether it's defense, people-to-people contact, VCs and startups, etc. Are we going to see something different? Are we just going to see the strengthening of this threshold?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for the Biden administration, and in this instance, I'm not speaking for USIBC, but I think it's clear that, Biden has a different leadership style. He's got a different organizational style. I think a lot of us that have been through an Obama administration are going to be familiar with the way that he tends to work in that arena. I think that, at least from early indications, they want to go back in and solve or change some of the relationships that they think are critical. I think the U.S.-Europe relationship, shouldn't surprise anyone that needs some tender, loving care. The multilateral approach, I think is going to be a particular target. Bottoms-up policy making will also be in there. But at the same time, some things have changed. There's going to be certain elements of whether it's the U.S.-China relationship or how global trade is viewed by the citizens of various democracies. Some of those things are going to alter the overall trajectory. But I think you're going to see, trying to resolve a couple of just near-term, problem areas. I don't think India is not on that, because India is not a problem. The relationship between the United States and India is so pervasive and agreed upon that, India may initially not get as much limelight because it hasn't really been an issue of conflict over, the last period of time. And so I think there'll be an opportunity to reset those. And it really creates, I think, a tremendous opportunity for India to promote its vision of the world, because India is going to be the president of G20 in 2022. This coming 2021 is going to be the planning year. We're going to set a series of agendas and meetings and all of those sorts of things. India is going to be have an outsized role in some of these global issues in the coming near term, and I encourage India to take that on as well. And so we're looking forward to working with both governments to try to move this agenda forward incrementally in a positive way.
Thanks, Jake. And I'm going to give the last question to Ambassador Pal. Ambassador Pal, the two short questions I have. One is on this whole question of multilateralism. As I was preparing for this panel, I read quite a lot about what Nest is doing in the emerging technology space, and you've got an emerging tech initiative, which in a sense seems like a small scale but very relevant way of testing this question of multilateralism, of getting different actors together to be talking about emerging technologies and kind of an organic way. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about this. And lastly, and here's perhaps an out of turn question, as an ambassador, a diplomat, and as the head of the division of Nest, do you see a different kind of initiative building out with the United States? Would you be open to a tech-to-tech dialogue, just like we have a 2+2 dialogue between the two countries?
Well, to talk about the ETI, or the Emerging Technologies Initiative first, I think it's very important that an enabling environment for emerging technologies try to incentivize research. And the ETI initiative was launched, therefore, in a very participative kind of concept of crowdsourcing in August this year. The Office of the Principal Scientific Advisor, the Science Policy Forum, and Nest Division and MEA came together to launch this. We wanted to identify technologies which would be of importance and relevance to India, develop feasible roadmaps to indigenize that and recommend appropriate policy choices, and to involve very diverse teams as an input into this, and not necessarily just the government. The long-term vision was, of course, to understand and anticipate the impact of these ETs on economy, employment, security, social equity, and global relations. And we again had some very focused conversations when we launched it. We've had an overwhelming response in terms of the expressions of interest across the 9 verticals that were put out in the space. And we are now having the External Experts Committee assess these over 180 EOIs that have been received. And then a selection would be made to ask a group of them to submit their strategy papers. And the idea is that they would then be deliberated by all the relevant stakeholders, not necessarily just the government officials, but also the industry leaders, the entrepreneurs, the diplomats, and of course the funding organizations. And Nest is going to be part of creating the synaptic discussions on the way forward. Coming to your next question, I have to say that Nest is actually about synapses. And in this whole debate of multilateralism, I think why foreign offices and diplomats like multilateralism is because it's inclusive, it's consultative, it's equitable, it kind of brings things to a point where the foundations are laid strong. Having said that, it's a reality that much of the multilateral structures around, they need a real overhaul. I mean, they need basic overhaul. So I don't think the solution is to create another bureaucracy on ETs. The ETs will bring about the flexibility in terms of the technologies. If you look at AI, which is going to be all pervasive in terms of, it's going to show up in various emerging technologies. So it will compel governments to really have a very, very flexible approach and response. I think what's going to happen in what can be expected reasonably is that countries who have good credentials in terms of being able to discuss the concepts and where their actions are not at divergence with what they say, I think you will find a natural congregation of those countries. And so some of the countries you named would be obvious partners. There are others who would be there as well. It'll be important in that dialogue to remove the asymmetry of information, to make the reference points empathetic, to remove the unnecessary protectionist tendencies and restrictive controls on technology, because ETs is not what we've seen so far in terms of technology. And mobility in the ET categories is also going to be a very important method of encouraging complementarity and synergy of effort. And I think this approach would also maximize the stakeholding, because the stakeholding clearly needs to be beyond industry. I would say that ETs will show responses across a spectrum. There will be different capacities, different assessments, perceptions to bridge. There will be gaps between word and deed for very valid reasons of geopolitics or national security or economics, which will need to be bridged. So the challenge is really going to be to bring these different reference points in the spectrum closer together and create an empathetic liaison, if you will, towards white light. How India and US go about connecting in the digital space is something that we'll need careful thought. But dialogue is the first step.
Ambassador Pal, thank you so much. Usually in physical conferences, the greatest part about it is this question of dialogue. We could finish this panel, go get a cup of coffee, a drink, and dinner, and continue that collaboration and dialogue. It's not possible. We're in the virtual environment. Hopefully this will end. But I do hope that we at Carnegie in India and across the world can play a key role in keeping this dialogue going in this crucial relationship as ET policies, privacy policies, and the basic ethos behind technology builds out the next many years. That's something that we are absolutely committed to. But with that, Renu Pal, Nandini Kannan, Jay Galish, Modan Saha, thank you so very much for joining us for this panel at the Global Technology Summit 2020.